My name is Winifred Duart. I'm 54 years old. I was standing in the back room of a hardware store that had belonged to my family for 41 years, holding a cassette tape with my grandfather's handwriting on the label, and my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it twice before I got it into the player. My mother was 11 feet away, arguing with an estate attorney about a signature date. The store was worth $340,000, and in about 90 seconds, the version of my family that had existed for my entire life was going to stop being true. My throat had gone dry the way it does right before you're sick, and there was a smell in that back room I will never forget, WD-40 and old cardboard and my grandfather's cigarettes, a smell that had outlived him by 6 years. If you're watching this right now, I want you to tell me where you are, what time it is for you, and whether it's raining, because where I was, it was 4:11 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and the sky had gone that flat gray color that makes everything feel like it's already over before it starts. I was the responsible one. That's not me being modest or bitter, it's just the job I was assigned somewhere around age 9, and I never once put it down. My sister Camille was born 18 months after me, and from the time she could talk, my mother, Deirdre, treated her like something rare that had to be protected from the ordinary friction of being a person. I got chores, Camille got compliments. I got told to toughen up when I cried. Camille got carried to bed when she pretended to be asleep on the couch at age 11. None of this was said out loud as a rule, but everyone in the house understood it the way you understand which floorboard creaks. My grandfather, Silas Duart, ran the hardware store in Elm Ridge, the one his own father had opened in the 1950s, and it was the one place where the rules were different. He didn't play favorites there. He handed me a broom the same week he handed Camille one, and he expected us both to sweep the same aisles. I loved that store the way some kids love a tree fort. It was mine in a way nothing else was, because nobody had decided in advance that Camille deserved it more. By the time I was in my 30s, I was working the books for that store part-time, unofficially, because my grandfather trusted numbers from me more than from an accountant he'd have to pay. I have a quiet head for figures. I like columns that balance. I've been divorced 11 years, I raised a son mostly on my own, and I built a life that isn't glamorous but is mine, paid for, nobody's charity case. My flaw, if I'm honest with you, is that I don't ask for things. I don't ask for credit, I don't ask for receipts, I don't ask my own mother to explain herself because some old part of me still believes that asking will prove I was never really wanted in the first place. That flaw is going to matter later, so hold on to it. My grandfather got sick in the spring I turned 49, lung problems, then his heart, then both at once. He held on for 14 months, and in that time my mother started talking in a way she never had before, floating phrases like, when things get settled, and once we know where everyone stands. Phrases with no subject and no object, phrases built to mean nothing if anyone challenged them and everything if nobody did. The first time she said it, we were in his kitchen and she was drying a mug that didn't need drying, and she said, almost to herself, "Your grandfather always did say the store should go to whoever could actually run it." Nobody in the room had asked her. That was the thing I couldn't shake for weeks afterward, nobody had asked. Camille had married a man named Desmond Ashby 9 years earlier. Desmond was an estate attorney with an office downtown and a laugh that arrived half a second before anything was actually funny. He was polished in the specific way that makes some people trust him instantly and makes other people, myself included, check their pockets. He'd handled a handful of small legal matters for my grandfather over the years, a lease dispute, a zoning question, and somewhere in there he'd become, without anyone formally deciding it, the family's lawyer for anything Duart-related. My grandfather liked him fine. Trusted him more than that was never something I saw evidence of, but trust doesn't always require evidence when it's inside a family. My grandfather's will, drawn up 8 years before he got sick, was simple. Article 4, the section he called the Equal Distribution Clause, split the store, the building it sat in, and his modest savings evenly between me and Camille. He'd told me that himself more than once, sitting on his porch with a beer he wasn't supposed to have. "Fair's fair, Winnie, you girls split it down the middle." I believed him completely, the way you believe gravity without checking. The warning moment came on a Sunday in October, 7 months before he died. We were all at my mother's house for dinner, and Camille mentioned lightly that she and Desmond had been thinking about, eventually, moving into the apartment above the store once Grandpa didn't need it anymore. My mother didn't correct her. My mother nodded along like this was already settled family business, already understood, and when I said, carefully, that the will split things evenly, my mother looked at me the way you look at someone who's brought up something mildly embarrassing at the wrong moment and said, "Nobody's fighting over anything, Winifred. Don't make this into a thing." I remember exactly how my stomach dropped, a small cold drop like missing a stair in the dark. I said nothing else that night. That was the flaw again doing its quiet work. My grandfather died on a Thursday morning in March, with my hand on his arm and the store radio playing low in the next room out of habit, because I'd been staying at his place those last weeks. I want to tell you I felt something clean and simple in that moment, but mostly what I felt was exhaustion so total it had a texture like wet sand. The funeral was small. The reading of the will 4 days later was not. It happened at Desmond's office, a cool gray room with a conference table too large for 6 people. My mother sat at the head of it, which struck me even then as strange, since she wasn't the one who died and wasn't the one whose will it was. Desmond read through the boilerplate quickly, and then he reached the part about the store, and he said there was a codicil dated 4 months before my grandfather's death that amended Article 4. Under the codicil, the store and the building went entirely to Camille, in recognition of her ongoing commitment to the family business. My savings inheritance stayed the same, a token roughly $11,000. My mother didn't look surprised. My mother looked for one unguarded half-second satisfied and then arranged her face into something more appropriate. I asked to see the codicil itself. Desmond slid it across the table, and I noticed, in the specific way you notice a wrong note in a song you've heard 1,000 times, that my grandfather's signature looked slightly too even, each letter sitting at the same height, when the man I knew had a signature that dipped and dragged because his hands shook in his last year. I didn't say anything. I folded my flaw around myself like a coat and told myself I was imagining it. But something had lodged itself under my ribs that afternoon, small and hard, and it did not leave. Here's what I understand now, looking back, about where my mother's certainty came from. When Deirdre was 26, her own father, my other grandfather, a man I never met, left the family dry cleaning business entirely to her older sister, a woman named Roberta, with a single line in his will calling Roberta the one who actually showed up. Deirdre had shown up too, every week for 6 years, but showing up quietly had never counted for anything in that house. And she'd spent the rest of her life believing that love which doesn't announce itself doesn't survive. I think some part of her decided, without ever saying it plainly, that she would not let that happen to whichever daughter she'd already, secretly cast as the one who actually mattered, and that somewhere along the way, that daughter had become Camille. And I had become the daughter who could be trusted to absorb it, the way she'd once had to absorb it herself. I drove home that night with the radio off, which I never do, because I couldn't stand the sound of anything. My mind kept circling one thought over and over, small and stupid and impossible to release, he told me himself. Fair's fair, Winnie. Somewhere in the 11 months I had left with him, someone had gotten to that document, and I was going to spend the rest of my life either finding out who, or pretending I hadn't noticed. I picked one that night in the dark in my own driveway before I'd even turned off the engine. I just didn't tell anyone yet. 3 weeks later, the family gathered at the store for what my mother called a transition celebration, new signage, a small reception, Camille formally announced as owner. I stood in the doorway of the store I had swept as a child and understood, with a kind of clarity that almost made me laugh out loud at how absurd my own life had gotten, that I was about to watch my inheritance get repainted in front of me with balloons involved. The reception was scheduled for 11 that Saturday morning, and by 10:40 the sidewalk out front already smelled like the bakery boxes someone had set on the folding table, cheap coffee, powdered sugar, the particular staleness of a room that's been aired out for an occasion instead of lived in. There were maybe 30 people there over the course of the morning, but the ones I remember individually were the ones standing closest when it happened. Odalise Ferreira, who'd lived next door to my grandfather for 22 years and still brought him tomatoes every August. A long-time customer named Harlan Dubrovnik, who'd bought his nails and his lumber from that counter since before I was born. My cousin Cassandra Okonkwo, who hugged me tight when I walked in and told me she couldn't believe how unfair the whole thing was. And a woman named Priscilla Nakamura from the Historical Society, there to photograph the new sign for the town newsletter. My mother stood at the front near the register with Camille beside her. And at 11:15 she tapped a spoon against a plastic cup and said, in the bright, reasonable voice she uses for things that are not reasonable at all, that she wanted to say a few words about the right person carrying this place forward. She talked about legacy and commitment and Camille's steady hands, and she never once looked in my direction, which somehow felt worse than if she had. Then she asked me, still smiling, still bright, if I'd mind handing over the spare set of keys I'd carried on my ring for 15 years, just so Camille could have the full set for the official handoff. In front of 30 people. In front of Harlan Dubrovnik, who'd known me since I was 7. My hand went cold before my brain caught up to why. I felt my pulse in my ears, a hard, stupid drum beat, and my face did the thing it always does under pressure, which is nothing at all. I've been trained since childhood to keep my face blank while something is actively being taken from me. Camille chose that moment to add her own note, a moment I still can't fully explain even now. She said lightly to the room that she hoped I'd understand it was just business, not personal, while she was standing under a banner with our family's actual last name on it, in a building our grandfather built with his own hands, telling me that erasing me from it wasn't personal. I unhooked the keys from my ring in front of everyone. My fingers wouldn't work right. It took 4 tries. Nobody in that room said a word in my defense, and the silence that followed, real silence, the kind where you can hear the refrigerator case humming in the back and somebody's shoe scuff against linoleum, lasted, by my count, 11 full seconds. I counted them because counting was the only thing my body could do that wasn't crying. I left before the coffee ran out. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes without turning the key, and at some point Odalise Ferreira knocked on my window, not to say anything grand, just to ask if I was all right to drive. And I remember being strangely, disproportionately grateful that one person in that whole building had thought to check. That night, alone in my kitchen, I opened my laptop, and instead of doing anything sensible, I typed my grandfather's name and the words notarized codicil into a search bar, with no plan and no idea what I was looking for. And that small, ordinary click of a mouse was the first real thing I'd done to fight back since the will was read. For 2 weeks I did nothing but read. Ohio's notary requirements, the definition of a codicil, what makes a will contestable, how long you have to file. I am not a lawyer. I am a woman with a good head for numbers and a stubborn streak nobody in my family had ever bothered to notice. And I discovered, somewhere around midnight on a Wednesday, that a codicil has to be witnessed by 2 people who are not beneficiaries. And I could not for the life of me remember 2 witnesses being in that conference room the day my grandfather supposedly signed it. I called the notary's office listed on the document the next morning. The number had been disconnected for over a year. That was the first thread, and it led nowhere clean. The notary listed, a man named Roy Petrosky, turned out to have retired to Florida 4 years before the codicil's date, and for 3 days I was convinced I'd found something enormous, a dead man's stamp. Forged wholesale until Teodora Vasquez, the document examiner I eventually hired, gently pointed out that Petrosky's old stamp had simply been recycled by the notary who bought his practice. A common and entirely legal thing to do. And the date discrepancy I'd been building a whole theory around turned out to be nothing but my own bad math on a leap year. I felt foolish. I also felt oddly a little more awake than I had in weeks, because chasing something, even the wrong something, had reminded my body what it felt like to move instead of absorb. Teodora came into the picture through Odalise, of all people, who mentioned over coffee that her niece did forensic document work for insurance disputes and might, as a favor, take a look. Teodora was maybe 60, unhurried, precise, the kind of person who says, I don't know yet instead of guessing, and I trusted her within 10 minutes for exactly that reason. She examined a scanned copy of the codicil and told me flatly that the pen pressure across my grandfather's signature was uniform in a way that suggested it had been traced from an existing signature rather than written fresh, and that the paper's watermark didn't match any stock the family attorney's office had used before that year. She didn't call it fraud yet. She called it worth a second look, which from her was practically a shout. The second real discovery came 10 days later from an unexpected direction. I'd gone back to the store, technically still permitted since I hadn't been formally banned from the building, to collect a box of my grandfather's personal effects Camille had set aside for me, an act of generosity that turned out to be more careless than kind. In the bottom of that box, wrapped in a shop rag, was an old cassette tape, the kind he used to record himself reading receipts aloud when his eyesight started going, labeled in his shaking, later years handwriting. For Winnie, if anyone tries anything. I sat down on the concrete floor of that back room and did not move for a long time. I want to tell you I played it immediately. I didn't. I sat with it in my glove compartment for 6 days, terrified of what was on it and equally terrified of what wasn't, because a small, exhausted part of me had gotten used to being the one who got left out, and some sick comfort lives in a wound you already know the shape of. My inner voice, the one I'd spent 40 years training to stay quiet, finally said something clear. You already know what you'll do if it proves them right. The only question left is whether you'll do it if it proves them wrong too. While I sat with that tape, the pressure campaign started, and it started fast. My mother called first on a Tuesday evening, and her voicemail was pure warm concern wrapped around a blade. Winifred, honey, I heard you've been asking Roy Petrosky's old office some strange questions, and I just want you to know, before this gets embarrassing for everyone, that your grandfather knew exactly what he was signing, and stirring things up isn't going to bring him back. It's just going to hurt Camille, who's already under enough pressure running that place. 2 days later, Camille texted, shorter and colder. Heard you're digging around trying to blow up my life over a building. Real mature. Grandpa would be humiliated by you right now, not me. Then 4 days after that, Desmond called from a blocked number, his tone gone entirely professional, entirely without the half-second laugh. I'd strongly advise against pursuing informal document review outside proper legal channels, Winifred. Allegations like this, if repeated publicly, could constitute defamation, and I'd hate to see this family end up in court over something so easily resolved with a conversation. None of them asked me a single question. All 3 of them told me in 3 different registers to stop. The second betrayal came from Cassandra, the cousin who'd hugged me tightest at the reception and called the whole thing unfair. She called the week after Desmond's voicemail, and I let myself believe for about 90 seconds that she was calling to help. Instead, she told me gently that she'd promised my mother she wouldn't get pulled into the middle of this, and that maybe it would be easier for everyone if I just let the store go. I asked her point blank if she believed the codicil was real. There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear her television in the background, and then she said she honestly didn't know and didn't think it was her place to find out. I hung up feeling the particular loneliness of being agreed with in private and abandoned in public. Teodora's real breakthrough came from a place none of us expected, not the signature at all, but the paper's watermark. Traced back to a specific ream purchased through Desmond's own office account 11 days after my grandfather's actual original will had already been finalized and locked in his safe deposit box, which meant the paper the codicil was printed on didn't exist yet on the date it claimed to have been signed. Teodora called this the kind of mistake people make when they're moving fast and confident nobody will ever check the receipts. And for the first time since the reading of the will, I felt something other than grief. I felt the specific, clean anger of watching a lie run out of places to hide. You're still here with me, so I suspect you already know the kind of family member who tells you to be quiet for the sake of peace, and I want you to notice something before we go any further. Every single person who told me to stop was someone who stood to lose something if I didn't. I played the tape for the first time on a Sunday, alone in my kitchen, 7 months to the day after my grandfather died. His voice came through thin and crackling, slower than I remembered, pausing between sentences the way he did in his last year. He talked about the store, about wanting it split evenly between my 2 girls, about a conversation he'd had with Deirdre that spring where she'd pushed him, more than once, to reconsider, and about how he told her plainly that he wasn't going to change a document he'd already decided on. Then his voice dropped and he said something I hadn't expected at all, something about a second copy of that original will, notarized the same week as the first, kept somewhere he trusted more than his own house, and the tape cut off mid-sentence, right as he started to say where. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called my grandfather's longtime insurance agent, then his church, then, on a hunch, the hardware store's own ancient floor safe, the one nobody had opened since before he got sick because everyone assumed it held nothing but old receipts and a spare cash drawer. Odalys, who still had a key from years of watering plants while he traveled, let me in before the store opened. Inside that safe, under a stack of yellowed invoices, was a sealed envelope from a second attorney's office 2 towns over, one Desmond had never handled anything through, containing a notarized original of my grandfather's true will, dated the same week as the tape, splitting the store evenly, exactly the way he'd always told me. I asked Teodora to come with me and I asked Odalise to be there too, and I called my mother and told her calmly that I wanted to meet at the store on Saturday morning to talk. I chose the store on purpose. It was the one place in this entire mess that still belonged in every real sense to the truth. We stood in the same spot where the keys had been taken from me, under the same banner, though someone had at least had the decency to take down the balloons. My mother arrived first, sharp and composed, already talking about how she hoped we could put this behind us like adults. Camille came in a few minutes later with Desmond, and I watched Desmond's practiced half-second laugh arrive and then die on his face when he saw Teodora standing beside me with a folder. I didn't raise my voice. I told them plainly that I had the original will, notarized 2 towns over, dated the same week as the codicil they'd presented, and that it split the store evenly, the way our grandfather had always said it would. My mother's face didn't move, but her hands did, gripping her purse strap so tightly her knuckles went pale. I told them about the paper stock traced to Desmond's office account, purchased 11 days after the will was supposedly finalized. My mother said too quickly that paper gets reordered all the time that this proved nothing. I told her about the notary stamp, recycled but legitimate, which had actually cleared my initial suspicion. I said this on purpose, calmly, because I wanted her to understand I hadn't built a case out of desperation. I'd built it out of patience, checking my own worst theories and throwing out the ones that didn't hold. Then I played the tape. His voice filled that small back room the same way it used to fill it when he was alive, telling stories to whoever would listen. And I watched my mother's composure finally crack somewhere around the sentence where he named her directly, where he said he wasn't going to change a document he'd already decided on. She said when it ended, voice tight and much smaller than I'd ever heard it, that she had only ever been trying to make sure Camille didn't end up the way she had, overlooked. She said, forgotten, and I told her, as gently as I could manage while my hands were shaking again, that overlooking one daughter to protect the other from feeling overlooked was still just overlooking a daughter. It had just changed which one. Camille didn't defend her mother and didn't defend herself either. She stood very still, staring at the tape recorder like it might still have more to say. Desmond tried one last angle, telling the room in his flattest lawyer voice that a homemade recording proved intention, not legal execution, and that we'd need probate court to sort out competing documents regardless. Teodora answered without raising her voice, which somehow landed harder than shouting would have. She said the paper trail she'd already flagged to the State Bar's ethics office that morning would likely settle the question before any court date arrived. Desmond's jaw worked once and he said nothing else. It wasn't the clean, dramatic collapse you see in movies. My mother didn't apologize, not really, and Camille left the room 5 minutes later without looking at me, sending a single text that evening that just said, "I need time," a sentence I'm still waiting to see the other half of. The formal consequences took another 4 months to fully land, and they landed differently for each of them because their roles had never been the same. Desmond was referred to the State Bar's disciplinary board for the backdated document and the paper trail tying it to his office account, and lost his license to practice in Ohio the following spring, not for the crime itself, technically, but for 2 years of similar shortcuts investigators found once they started looking. Camille signed over full title to her half of the store within the month quietly, and moved out of state with Desmond not long after his suspension, which I understood as its own kind of consequence. The exile of having to build a new life somewhere nobody already knows what you did. The store still smells like WD-40 and old cardboard, and some mornings opening up alone before the first customer arrives. That smell still catches me off guard the way it did the day I first pressed play on that cassette tape, except now it doesn't feel like dread waiting in my chest. It feels like proof that I was standing in the right place the whole time, even when nobody else believed I was. I won't pretend winning felt like winning. My mother and I speak maybe 4 times a year now, short, careful conversations about nothing, and some nights I still catch myself missing the mother I thought I had, which is a strange kind of grief, mourning someone who's still alive and just never was who you needed. That's the part nobody warns you about. You can get the store back and the paperwork and the apology that never quite comes and still lose the thing you actually wanted, which was just, at some point, to matter without having to prove it. There was one moment, weeks later, that still makes me shake my head at how small the engine of it turned out to be. Teodora told me the bar investigator's whole case, in the end, traced back to somebody being too impatient to wait for the right stationery to arrive. A family, a store, 4 months of my life undone by a man who couldn't wait for a paper order. I laughed out loud in my kitchen alone for the first time in a year, and it wasn't a happy sound exactly, but it was mine. So I'll leave you with this. The real question in all of it was never who deserved the store. Here's my honest observation after living through it. Almost nobody in a family like mine ever says the unfair thing out loud. They just quietly build a world around it and dare you to be the one who points at it first. I had to ask myself in that back room with the tape recorder in my hands, which mattered more, the peace or the truth. So I'll ask you the same thing. If you had to choose right now between staying quiet to keep the peace or saying the true thing out loud and losing that peace for good, which one would you actually pick? Not the answer that sounds good, the one you'd really do at 2 in the morning with the lights off. I'll ask you one more thing before I go, a different question than the one I just left you with. Was I supposed to forgive her for choosing Camille, or was I only ever supposed to stop needing her to choose me at all? This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment, and any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental. Some inheritances are money and property. Others are just finally understanding, at 54, exactly what you were worth all along, and refusing to negotiate it back down.